Let's get this party started. So, hi everybody. As Jessica said, my name is Gene Hardy. Flew in last night. Very excited to be here. I'm excited to meet all of you today. So, the title of my talk is Rural Computing Perspectives on Human-Centered Computing from Rural Michigan. So I consider myself to be something of a pandemic professor. Is this going to work? There it goes. I started my tenure track job in August of 2020, finishing my PhD in the throes of the pandemic in March, April, June, May, June of 2020. And I am an ethnographer. So that means that I go into communities and I investigate how they use technology, how they deploy technology for various purposes, both as individuals and organizations and businesses. And due to COVID restrictions, I could not actually start doing my research until almost a year and a half into being a professor. So as soon as possible, I started doing research in the fall of 2021. And the images you see here are from Ishpeming, Michigan. And Ishpeming, Michigan is a former iron mining town, a population of about 4,000 people. The iron mining industry collapsed there circa 1930, started to collapse circa 1930, 1940. The last iron mine pictured here closed in 1987. And I was very interested in how different types of community organizations in rural areas were using new forms of digital technology, or not even new forms of digital technology, but we're using digital technology in new ways to do things like community outreach in still a pandemic era where a lot of people weren't comfortable necessarily going out into community spaces and were still engaged in Zoom calls, et cetera, and how they were sort of using digital technology specifically for purposes of community outreach. So I attended the outreach session of this community-based farm in Ishpeming called Partridge Creek Farms. They had been granted a 3.5-acre brownfield site. I'll explain a little bit more what that means later, by the city to develop actually a local community farm that would be facilitating food access to the local school district, as well as starting a local community supported agricultural program. And they were doing some outreach here in the picture on the left at the local senior center, because the local senior housing facility was right next to this garden plot or this 3.5-acre farm plot they were going to be building. So I was there basically to see how are they using technology to engage in community members, older adults, et cetera, youth, et cetera. And after I finished observing this community session, I do my typical thing where I go up to them like, oh, thank you very much for letting me hang out with you today. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to observe the work of your organization. If you ever need anything, just like let me know. I have resources because I'm a professor at a university, and that's just sort of how these things work, right? Very shortly after, like within a week, I get an email from the executive director of the organization that says, hey, Gene, we've been thinking about adopting these things called soil sensors. Have you heard of these before? And they started explaining to me some of the things that they wanted to use digital agriculture sensors for within the sort of the community agriculture business that they were setting up and the various issues they faced related to even figuring out how to begin this process. So me being me, I saw this as an excellent opportunity to develop a community partnership and build relationships with a research partner. And I took them on. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about today. But at the end of the day, this type of process of technology adoption isn't necessarily like cutting edge, right? Like these sensors have been around for 2, 3 decades at this point. This is nothing new. It's not necessarily something that is cutting edge, it's not sexy, it doesn't necessarily get me that big National Science Foundation grant, right, to fund PhD students and master's students. But at the end of the day, I saw a lot of value in working with rural community organizations to address these very, very sort of pertinent and timely technological issues that they were facing. So through this process in the past few years, as I've been working on this project with them and sort of expanding my research, I've been asking this question about sort of what does it mean to prioritize the technological needs of rural communities whose problems are not really sexy, they're not cutting edge, especially in a sort of academic and market-based landscape that seem to have sort of moved past these very simple issues of things like technology adoption, right? Like nobody reads technology adoption papers anymore, right? It's like not interesting. It's not sort of worth publishing. They don't get published in the best venues, et cetera. But I actually think that these are still incredibly important issues that we need to be addressing. So my research in this area has taken a lot of different directions. Like I said, I use ethnographic methods. I also use design methods, particularly participatory design methods, working with things like economic and community development organizations, civic leaders, businesses, community organizations to respond to the various types of structural inequalities that lead to rural people, rural organizations, and rural businesses to not be able to adopt or engage in the typical types of technology that we often take for granted. So this includes sort of ethnographic research on the emergence of innovation systems in the high-tech economy in rural Michigan, starting in the late 2010s, ethnographic and design research on policy and practice to promote broadband development in very rural areas of Michigan, and then the first case study that I'll talk to you about today, which is ethnographic and design research on digital agriculture adoption in low resource and low income rural communities. So a little bit about me. So as Jessica said, I'm an assistant professor. I have my PhD and my Master's of Science in Information from University of Michigan. I'm an 8th generation rural Michigander, deep sort of family ties to rural places. I also live on a 43-acre farm with my husband and lots of dairy and meat goats. A baby obviously pictured here because everybody loves baby goats. Recently, I took the position as the Associate Director of the Quello Center for Media and Information Policy, which is actually why I'm here this weekend, because the annual conference, they change the name all the time, but it used to be called the Telecommunications Policy and Research Conference, is in DC this weekend, so I'm going to be attending that. And then I also direct the Rural Computing Research Consortium at Michigan State University. So for my talk today, I'm going to go over a few different things. So I'm going to talk about rural computing and then a framework that I've been sort of developing related to rural computing, especially how we think about research translation for rural communities specifically. I'm going to use the case study of the digital agriculture adoption and talk about translational work in computing. And then if I have time, I'll try to get into some community-centered work using design methods. So first off, what is this question of rural computing? I use it in the title of my talk. I direct this thing called the Rural Computing Research Consortium. I don't think anybody in this room probably does rural computing research. I don't see Mega, so maybe, yeah. So I take what I call a big tent approach to rural computing. I am fairly technology agnostic. I think about computing in an incredibly broad sense, both within the technology itself, as well as the users and the location. So you can see obviously an AI generated image of a circus tent with lots of different types of technology in it here that I made. And I first began conceptualizing this when I started at MSU as a professor and tried to find a network of people who were also interested in these ideas. When I started in 2020, there were no in-person events. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to start this research consortium, try to find like-minded faculty and graduate students across campus who are interested or already doing research in rural communities. And we have members from 5 different colleges at Michigan State, including the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, the College of Computer Engineering, human medicine, ag and natural resources, social sciences, et cetera. And the values related to this work is largely that rural computing should be technology agnostic. It should bring together both the social and the technical through a specific rural lens. That we recognize the value in deeply interdisciplinary work, bringing in people who are social scientists as well as computer scientists and information scientists all together on similar projects, and then working to translate this work for each other. So allowing sort of technical people to translate their work to social scientific people and vice versa, right? So what does it mean to sort of bring together the social and the technical through a rural lens? So I've written sort of extensively about this in a lot of my research, and rural communities face a very sort of specific and unique landscape of social and technical problems that are very deeply intertwined, that need to be taken into consideration in all the research that we do in rural areas. And that includes things like lagging infrastructure. So if you pay attention at all the broadband infrastructure, you know that like literally hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being invested in broadband infrastructure in rural communities in the United States. And that's because like tens of millions of rural people in the United States literally don't have wired internet infrastructure, including myself. So my farm does not have wired internet infrastructure, despite being literally 15 miles outside of East Lansing, Michigan. There is extreme distrust in information institutions in rural areas, largely because rural people don't see themselves as being represented by sort of civic and information news and media institutions, et cetera. There's lower rates of information and digital literacy, lower rates of broadband adoption and device ownership, even taking into account lagging infrastructure. There's obviously lower population density, and this leads to, this sort of determines a lot fewer services, less infrastructure, unsustainable development in current tax models where what development is largely driven by local tax dollars. Lower levels of diversity, more people are more susceptible to filter bubbles, and then of course a lot of the typical things we talk about in rural areas like rural poverty, health access, et cetera, et cetera. If you're interested in a sort of framing for this, I published a paper at the I-Conference a few years ago called the Rural Information Penalty, where I start to sort of explore some of these ideas, if you're interested in reading a little bit more. But I will say sort of rural computing from my perspective as an HCI person is of course sort of has a foundation in HCI. And I've been working on sort of developing out this type of subfield, whatever we want to call it, for 9 years at this point. So it started with a CSCW workshop in 2018, and then moved into a CSCW paper in 2019 about trying to understand how we even conceptualize rurality in HCI. And then most recently in 2021, we published a special issue of Transactions of the ACM on Human-Computer Interaction, on performing rurality with computing, to try to move beyond just sort of descriptive understandings of rurality and try to understand actually how do rural people themselves sort of conceptualize rurality within the context of computing. So I'm going to sort of briefly introduce this preliminary framework for guiding rural computing research. This is still a very new and nascent idea. I haven't published this anywhere, so I'm very open to feedback and ideas that you might have. I'm boldly the first two things here because that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. But I believe that rural computing research should do the following, and I developed this framework based on the past 12 years of doing rural computing research with a variety of populations in a variety of places in rural Michigan. So I believe that rural computing should apply community-centered methods and approaches to design and knowledge production, not surprising, right? That we should focus intentionally on translational computing work, something I'm going to focus a lot on today. That we need to do things like evaluate long-term sustainability of technological interventions beyond research timelines, right? So that we don't parachute into communities, deploy technology, leave, and with us leaves the technology. We need to acknowledge and design for diverse connectivity realities, including limited broadband, intermittent service, varied access to device access. So oftentimes when I talk to people in rural communities, cellular infrastructure is the primary way that they get access to the internet, and cellular infrastructure similarly is not robust in rural communities, even to this day. We should also be thinking about employing longitudinal research, in part because if any of you are interested in doing rural computing research, you're going to need a long time to do it. And that's because it's very difficult to do short-term research in rural communities. It takes a long time to build up trust. It takes a long time to build up relationships. I've been working with Partridge Creek Farm, who I'll be talking about shortly, for almost 5 years now. And we still have a pilot project, essentially, right? We also need to do things like considering the role of geographic distance, how it impacts technology adoption, maintenance, support, recognizing rural communities as heterogeneous rather than monolithic. So a rural community in Maryland is going to look very different than a rural community in Michigan, which is going to look very different than a rural community in Alaska, et cetera, right? We also need to do things like addressing potential tensions between technological change and cultural preservation. So I believe that one of the reasons that a lot of rural communities are reticent to adopting certain types of digital technology is because they see it as at odds actually with sort of cultural relativism, with cultural aspects of rural communities, and a lot of other things, right? So this is just sort of a preliminary list of the things that we should sort of consider in rural computing research. So first things first, let's talk about applied translational work in rural computing. So where is translational work in rural computing? By translational, I mean that like, how do we translate work from researchers, labs, et cetera, to the people on the ground who are utilizing this, right? So computational research is often focused, of course, on the cutting edge. This work is incentivized through a lot of different mechanisms, right? So universities and research labs are structured in ways that incentivize cutting edge research, and that's partially due to a desire for status. People want to be the first person to do something. You know, when we write research papers, we have to do things like identify research gaps and talk about the novelty of our ideas, et cetera. Also, research incentive structures such as grants, so how we actually get money to do our research, prioritize specific types of innovation over translation work, even when that translation means diffusion of innovation. So in other words, the organizations like the National Science Foundation, who fund a lot of computing research, they are prioritizing things that are new and advanced, sort of the state of the field. Not necessarily like, how do we take this technology from 20 years ago and make it easy to use for poor rural people, right? Like those things generally don't get funded in the same way that, like, everything related to artificial intelligence is getting funded today. So as information and computer scientists, we usually think of our applied work happening in places like the classroom, right? So we're translating research ideas, using papers and classroom discussions, training sort of future computing professionals to take these ideas and deploy them into the organizations and industries that they wind up working with, right? We oftentimes will lead this to corporations who we see as sort of translating our ideas into actual products that make it into the hands of real people, right? And then sometimes we also do this type of translational work in service or volunteer work with organizations and community groups that we might be a part of. But in my experience, this actually happens very rarely. So this keeps translational computing research in this really weird space where it's not cutting edge and it's not seen as a research priority. Yet, as I will argue today, it's actually an incredibly important area of research that we should be tackling. And this is very evident in rural computing research. So the vast majority of technical work in advancing the cutting edge of computing in areas of like agriculture, remote sensing, natural sciences, et cetera, this largely focuses on things today like, drone imaging, edge computing for digital agriculture, using machine learning algorithms to do additional sort of predictive work with respect to, drought response, those types of things, right? And then the more socio-technical work is concerned with things like abstract notions of adoption or specific applications of technology. Rarely do we see projects where the goal is to take the most advanced and generative applications of things like precision ag and make it so the most disadvantaged or the least likely people to use it can use it. And I would argue that this doesn't have to be the case, that actually we should be incentivizing and prioritizing this sort of translational work and thinking about what it means to translate sort of technological progress and technological innovation to the people who need it most. And there's a lot of actually existing models for how to do this work. So there's this thing called the extension model in agriculture and natural resource work. So extension research, does UMD have an extension office? Okay, so UMD has an extension office, right? Michigan State University has an extension office. Extension research oftentimes is done by research scientists that work in areas like ag, natural resources, maybe community and economic development, urban planning, those types of things. And their goal is to bridge the academic research that happens in universities and the practical applications of that scientific knowledge through that research. So there are actually models of how we can do this in places like extension, where they actually like value and reward and center these sort of translational models. And this includes dissemination, translation, capacity building of, and oftentimes in extension, farmers or organizations, participatory engagement, engaging in policymaking, all these different types of things. And these are all part of this sort of scientific milieu. And I would argue that computing needs a similar model and needs it very, very soon if we aren't going to see this sort of gap between sort of the rich and the poor with respect to computing resources sort of amplify. So my focus today in this first case study is on Partridge Creek Farm. As I mentioned, they are a community-based agriculture organization in Ishpeming, Michigan. Their primary mission and primary goal is healthy food access and food education. So like many rural communities, they are largely a food desert. It is very difficult to get fresh produce there. When it does arrive there, because it's so remote, it is a 6-hour drive from the nearest metropolitan area, which means it's a 6-hour drive from the nearest grocery distribution center. Usually the produce is of incredibly low quality and it's very expensive. So they are very interested in how you sort of bridge access to things like fresh produce, primarily starting in the local schools. As I mentioned, it's post-mining. This is important because basically the entire city of Ishpeming sits on top of a toxic waste site. So there is legacy mining waste just below the surface of the entire city, which means that growing food there is also incredibly complicated. It is a very remote rural community, like I said, 6-hour drive from the nearest metropolitan area. 18% of its population is food insecure. 62% of its students are eligible for free or reduced lunch. and then nearly half of its population is considered asset limited, income constrained, but employed. So basically half of its population is considered low income. So this project was supported by the Michigan State University Center for Economic and Community Development through CARES Act funds, through the Comprehensive Economic Recovery Initiative that was funded by, I forget if it was Trump or Biden who passed the CARES Act, but one of those presidents in the recent past passed this. And fortunately, it trickled down, and a few $1,000s of it trickled down into my hands. And I'm going to talk about 3 phases of this research. First, data needs and technical requirements. Second, site evaluation, sensor testing, and developing data flows, and then sort of evaluation and next steps. So this project is called Promoting Digital Agriculture and Community-Based Agricultural Organizations. This is very much centered around a lens of digital equity, which should be of no surprise to any of you as people interested in the HCI. So seeking to address a market imbalance in literacy around digital tools to monitor things like soil quality and agricultural inputs over time, and then also using digital tools to promote efficiency. And this is very important, in part because Ishpeming, Michigan gets about 140 inches of snow a year. Usually they get their first snowstorm in October and their last snowstorm in May. So the ground starts to thaw in June and it stays thawed until about early November. So they have a very short growing season, about 3 months, which means they have to be very efficient with the way that they approach growing food. And they wanted to figure out how to use digital tools to promote this efficiency, and then also obviously to create new forms of data that could help inform their decision-making processes. So a couple of broader questions, sort of how to make existing systems cheaper and more accessible, how to develop sort of a community level, like educational or skills development process around this that would not only promote technology adoption, but then also facilitate a type of longevity so that they could actually keep these technologies working. And then, of course, how to do this in a collective and participatory way as somebody who is a community-based and participatory researcher. So data collection was wide-ranging. So I conducted preliminary meetings with all staff of the agricultural organization. I hosted a converged and all-hands meeting with them in spring of 2022 with all of their staff as well as their volunteers to sort of discuss the adoption strategy. Out of that meeting, essentially like a tech task force emerged that led the charge for adopting these technologies. I conducted ethnographic observations in this community in spring and summer of 2022, alongside interviews with their staff and their board members and walking tours of their garden sites, et cetera. And then with that task force, I attended their meetings throughout the duration of the project. So first things first was sort of identifying their data needs, right? So they want to adopt these sort of data centric types of technology. What type of data do they want, right? They largely were not sure. So part of our initial conversations were first and foremost trying to figure out what data made the most sense for them. So we experimented with a lot of different things. Cheaper sensors these days are really good at doing things like soil temperature, soil moisture, sunlight readings. pH sensors are a little bit more expensive, and so are nutrient sensors. But in the long run, they were really prioritized that these sensors should serve this sort of long-term goal of efficiency, especially with respect to saving money. So for example, some of their major costs included pH strips, so being able to test the pH balance of the soil because that's important for growing specialty crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, fruits and vegetables, et cetera. They also were exclusively reliant on their local water utility. So for those of you who don't know, most agricultural businesses operate on wells. So they pay to drill a well and then they use that well until they exhaust it. So the water doesn't necessarily cost them anything except for the cost of drilling the well. Because Ishpeming is on top of a toxic waste site, they cannot drill a well. If they drill a well, they start spewing toxic water onto all their fruits and vegetables, right? So instead, they actually have to hook up to the local sewer system. And if any of you in this room pay for your water bill, you know how expensive it is to be connected to a municipal water utility. And when you're using hundreds of gallons of water a day, that becomes incredibly expensive. So actually, just the summer before I started working with them, they had a leak at one of their sites and they wound up with a $5,000 water bill one month. That $5,000 water bill is essentially their entire operational budget for that entire month, right? So they basically had to choose between paying people's salaries and paying their volunteers and paying for their water bill, right? So one of the things that they were very sort of conscious is how do we actually preserve water in the long run? So fortunately for me, there was actually some existing sort of technology champions in the volunteer base of the organization. So they had actually already implemented a GIS system where they were tracking where the food was planted, when it was planted, and what was planted in which of their plots. So we had a sort of a long conversation about sort of how might we complement existing GIS systems that they have. But we wound up not integrating these things because it would have been technologically more difficult than they had the ability to sustain. But one of the most important things for the sensors specifically was that they had to be wireless, so there's no electricity. They had to be low cost, so they didn't have any money to buy these things. I only had $5,000 to run through this whole project. They had to be battery operated, and they had to not require Wi-Fi because there's no Wi-Fi, right? These are the complicated things, right? So we wound up going with an off-the-shelf model made by this company called Seed Studio, SEEED Studio. And we identified what was both effective for a limited budget, as well as what might translate to other types of organizations like this. So typical sensors marketed to commercial facilities were way too expensive. And DIY solutions meant that we needed the knowledge within the organization to actually fix these things when they broke, to do all the like Arduino or Raspberry Pi coding that was necessary to maintain them, and to just sort of figure out how to fix these things, maybe implement new types of sensors, et cetera. So we settled on moisture, sunlight, and CO2 sensors from Seed Studio. So this one's a sunlight sensor, this one's a soil moisture sensor, and they are based on long-range radio frequency. So if you didn't know this, the United States has public radio frequencies around the 800, 900 megahertz frequency. These are based on 915 megahertz. So they can transmit very simple data, just strings of letters and numbers, right? It's much more difficult to transmit things like images. But for our purposes, when it's just sort of bit strings that equate to what is the soil moisture reading of this right now, totally works great. Another great thing is that they're off the shelf. And because they are at a consumer price, they're really meant for people who are doing this in their gardens just for fun. They're about $100, $115 a piece. There's actually a really extensive support and online community for troubleshooting issues that are fairly accessible for people that don't have a lot of technical background. So site evaluation, so we bought these things, where do we put them? Site evaluation was actually really easy because the staff already had this embodied knowledge of exactly where they knew that the water issues were, right? So those sites were automatically the places that we're go to, specifically the tomato plots, because those are very water intensive and require the most sort of input when it comes to the cost for water. Sensors were also deployed at the composting site because their primary revenue source was actually the composting business that they had set up as a subsidiary of their organization. So that was actually how they funded most of their work, was through selling compost. So a little bit of details online about the deployment. So there are little details online about deployment in this specific context. Like I said, it was mostly meant for people who were doing this in like home gardens. So testing was a little bit laborious, so determining best locations for best data, what the appropriate distance to the LoRa gateway. So we had to get access to the roof of a local building so we could set up a gateway a waterproof gateway on the roof that would then be able to collect the data. You don't need line of sight, but it's better to have a good line of sight. So collect the data from further distances. And then also figuring out what data visualization software would be best. We found details online about utilizing a service called Data Cake that we actually reached out to and said that we were a nonprofit service interested in doing this, and they gave us free access to their product. So that was really, really excellent, and was a cost that we didn't have to deal with. So we bought these things, we installed them, we figured out how to set them up, we set up a data visualization platform. What's next? So we had to go into evaluation, right? So the pro process from the perspective of Partridge Creek Farm was overwhelmingly positive, though in reflection, it was a lot more work than we initially intended. I actually hired them a 20-hour-a-week intern for the summer, and she was dealing with this for 3 straight months, right? Even with a paid summer intern who is dedicated to this project, it was still a lot of work for this organization. Decision-making and communication, of course, takes a long time with a largely volunteer organization and a volunteer working group. And then the centralized documentation of the process meant that we were very conscious in how we documented the process to ensure that the handoff to future staff and interns would be easy. So that way, next summer's intern, they actually prioritize this. So they hired us an intern the following summer, specifically to work on sort of technology integration, and we're able to sort of continue this work. So some takeaways. So technology adoption in the face of limited capacity. I'm very interested in this idea of helping organizations who don't have the capacity to sort of help themselves, right? They don't have the skills, they don't have the staff, et cetera. So obviously we're interested in things like selecting the appropriate technology. So we want to use existing technology that has a lot of support mechanisms. We want to be conscious of people's skills levels. We want to be conscious of longevity. So this is a picture of the CO2 sensor right here. These have a battery life of 3 to 4 years. So they're fairly robust technology that doesn't wear down very quickly. So they do have this sort of long life cycle. And then of course, the geographic and infrastructural constraints related to things like lack of Wi-Fi, closeness to gateways, those types of things. We also wanted to incorporate new technology into existing practices, and then harness local technology champions whenever possible. One of the most important things for me that came out of this entire process actually happened on not necessarily in one of the meetings that I had with the tech task force, but was in a walking tour of the various sites that this organization has in Ishpeming. And I was walking with their executive director, and they had recently just had sort of an all-hands staff and board meeting to do some strategizing about their organization. And she was talking about how she was feeling like the organization was kind of engaging in this thing that nonprofits called mission creep. And it's this idea that you see opportunities on the horizon for your organization to engage in, maybe a new funding opportunity in an area that you don't currently work. So they mostly work with K through 12 education. So, what would it mean to engage in reaching out for, like, seeking out funding to work with elderly people, for example? And this is great, right? Because it means that your work is more impactful, but it also means that you stretch your organization thinner and thinner, you have less of a specialty, and you're constantly winding up seeking out sort of new resources to this work. So I actually found a lot of synergy between this idea of sort of nonprofit mission creep and then what I call data-driven mission creep. And I talk about this as sort of like the shiny new object problem. Organizations and people often get distracted by the shiniest, newest, the new iPhone, the new Apple Watch, the new laptop, the new chip, whatever we're talking about, right? And this is sort of similar in with respect to digital ag. So we had lots of conversations early on about how this could actually be really, really awesome, right? Like, new data that we were never able to collect before, new workflows to figure out how to best utilize the new data. Maybe we could even monetize this data. We're a really unique case, right? So maybe we can monetize this data. And then also many different ways to actually take this data and figure out what to do with it, right? So through these early conversations, we identified that mission creep could actually be a really serious issue. And because of this, we were consciously sort of setting boundaries around this work to ensure that we weren't getting distracted by the sort of shiny new object problem. And instead, we're focusing on the original sort of goals for this project, which was to increase efficiencies and create specific types of new data for the organization to feed into those efficiencies. So I published an article based on this work earlier this year in the Journal of Extension. If you're interested in reading more, it covers a lot of the material I just covered, just with a little bit more detail, and it's open access, so it's easy to get to. So some future work in this space. So I'm actually working this semester with an undergraduate computer science student on an independent study, and we're developing out a small scale automated irrigation system. He's really interested in issues of security, and radio frequency LoRa based transmission is actually really insecure because it's public. So he's very interested in sort of exploring how digital agriculture applications that use LoRa can be exploited by bad actors. And in that process, he's really smart and can do all this stuff. So he's going to be building this irrigation system for me. And we are planning on trying to figure out how to scale it up and deploying it on the 3.5 acre farm site and PCF as sort of a low cost, large scale effort to actually try to make real substantive inroads in their water usage. We're also in general interested in reverse engineering sensors for lower costs. I've had a couple of master's students who've been working on this for the past few years. It's very interesting, but as you can imagine, it requires a lot of technical acumen, coding ability, et cetera. And we haven't really gotten to the point to figure out how we could maybe set up data visualization platforms or some type of browser-based interface that would make this easier for people who don't have the technical skills to do this. As I said earlier, this work isn't sexy. So actually, I've had 3 grants rejected in the past 3 years to try to fund this work, largely because of the quote unquote lack of novelty. So this work is incredibly difficult to get funded. I'm funding it basically out of my own pocket right now, and through the generosity of students who want to do independent studies with me, right? Still seeking out funding to do this work and to expand it, but we'll see how it goes. So I want to leave plenty of room. So I have like, I don't know, 10 more minutes and then 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'll talk a little bit about this second case study, but we'll see how far I get. And this is related to community-centered infrastructure design in rural Michigan. So I'm very interested in rethinking human-centered design to leverage communities and for something called community-centered design. So thinking about community-centered design as a design process, much like human-centered design, that centers a specific community as a use case or a problem space. So I'm not going to talk about what communities are. You guys probably know this, but they're broad and various. Communities as a use case. So how does X community use Y technology, artifact, product, or service? Or community as a problem space. How do we design for X community to address Y problem or need? So I have been doing some research the past 3 years at this point on rural broadband deployment in the state of Michigan, in part because there is funding in this space and I was able to get funding in this space to do this work. So we're very interested in people's lived experience of digital disconnectedness and how we can think of developing broadband infrastructure from a community-centered perspective rather than a corporate-centered perspective. Right now, broadband infrastructure is largely developed almost exclusively by corporations who are funded by the federal government to do this work, because we privatized the vast majority of our internet infrastructure in the early 1990s-ish. Started in the 1980s, really exploded in the 1990s. So I used, who in this room has heard of design probes before? A handful of people? Okay. If you haven't heard of design probes before, I highly encourage you to explore them. They're this really, really interesting method. They're sort of an exploratory research tool in HCI that's meant to try to gather a more like deep and place-based experience of a sort of person's everyday life. So there's these usual sort of designerly kind of creative exercises that you give to people. You ask them to do these exercises over a period of time, oftentimes, photo diaries, reflective activities, different types of things. And they're meant to capture aspects of a person's life that would actually be really difficult to do if you were there with them, right? So we are obviously, when we are doing in-person observation, there's particular types of bias. We oftentimes don't have access to people's homes. We oftentimes don't have access to sort of a longitudinal perspective on people's daily lived experience, et cetera. And they rely on the participant to do the work in sort of sensory and tangible embedded in their lived environment. So we created a series of design probes to deploy in rural communities. You can't see them very well from the back, but who remembers, I don't know if any of you are so when I was growing up, one of the most exciting parts about going on a road trip was stopping at all the different rest areas and getting different sort of pamphlets where you'd be able to color and do little word games and stuff like that. So we sort of ripped on that and created a little tourism pamphlet that people could fill out. We created a message in a bottle where we asked people to write letters to urban people about what it was like to live in a rural community. We had these little Wi-Fi symbols in an effort to get people to sort of reflect on how connected or disconnected they felt at particular times in their life, and then sort of engage in creative exercises with these Wi-Fi materials. We also had a photo diary exercise, a variety of different things that we deployed with people. And the purpose of this was largely to understand how people felt connected or disconnected in their daily life. So these were people who were living in 2 very digitally disconnected communities in rural Michigan. One that was completely devoid of broadband infrastructure, and another that was a very low income community where broadband adoption was around 25%, despite the fact that the entire community was actually connected to broadband. And these design probes really like failed miserably. So they were a complete disaster. I deployed them with 12 people. So 4 design probes with 12 people. I did not get a single design probe returned. Despite the fact that we paid people $75. I had a PhD student who had spent the past 6 months in these communities developing relationships with every single person we deployed them with. So this was supposed to be the pilot. We deployed them with people we already had good research relationships with, and not a single one of them returned them. So it was a complete disaster and a waste of 18 months of my life. But that is also a lesson in research. If any of you decide to pursue PhDs or faculty careers, that sometimes things go disastrously wrong. And you have to sort of bite the bullet and figure out what to do next. And that's what I did. So first things first, we had to figure out why these things failed. So I sent my PhD student back a month after people failed to turn them in to try to get them to turn them in. 2 months after I sent them out, nobody turned them in, right? So I was like, okay, if people don't want to turn them in, at least try to have a conversation with them about why they didn't. So they found they were too intensive, too time intensive, that they were too personal, they were too intrusive. So they asked people to sort of disclose personal things about themselves they didn't feel comfortable with. And supposedly they were difficult to integrate into their everyday life. So even though we piloted them with people we knew we had previous relationships with, this was not enough. Despite our familiarity, I'm from this region, so like I don't know these people, but like I know people who know people that know these people. Like I have an in, like I can talk about the like local bars, all those types of things. Despite that, there were still issues of trust, right? And if we wanted to engage rural residents in creative activities, we realized that we needed to find something where we could meet them in the middle. And that in reality, we probably needed to engage in creative activities with them in the room, not from afar. So instead, we decided to create a board game. So we created this game called the Game of Rural Life. And we sought to, so who in here has played the Game of Life? So quite a few of you. So for those of you who haven't played it, it's essentially a game where you play out the lifespan of an adult. So you at the beginning you graduate high school and you decide if you're going to like go into the career or if you're going to college. And at the very end you retire. And throughout this process you sort of run into lots of different obstacles. You get married, you might have kids, your relatives die, you get a promotion, your house burns down, all kinds of weird stuff, right? So we took this game and we sort of remixed it. So we made it specifically about rural experiences of life, and we included a bunch of things related to infrastructural breakdown. So bridges going out, grocery stores closing, local schools closing, internet going down, blizzards, all types of things. And an effort to try to get at people's lived experience of infrastructural breakdown that we believe would be really important for sort of understanding experiences of connectedness and how people in their communities respond to these things. So I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this work, but the results are being published in the proceedings of the 2025 Conference on Communities and Technology. So this is also a lesson when things fail miserably and you've blown all your money on a prior research project that's totally failed, sometimes you can sort of spin something out that sort of recovers a little bit and still get a publication out of it. So actually this work was, I deployed this board game at a couple of rural development conferences in Michigan and people really, really loved it. I was actually brought on to USDA, United States Department of Agriculture project by a consortium, a broadband consortium in the state of Michigan to develop a board game to train rural townships officials on broadband planning and resource allocation. So actually you can see a picture of the first version of the game here. We've created the second version of the game since and sort of are interested in this question of can games help rural broadband leaders better understand resource allocation and learn about issues of digital equity and how can we sort of deploy. So we're going to be deploying this game in rural townships throughout the state of Michigan starting in January to sort of understand how they can be tools for helping these volunteers largely better understand what their requirements and tasks are as people on broadband task forces. So with that, I'm going to close and open up for questions. I'm happy to explore any additional methodological details of either of those projects, talk more about my framework, talk about I have a lot of different projects that I've worked on. So with that, I guess I will open it up.